a kind gesture. The little diner nestled at the corner of Main Street was always bustling during lunch hour. For Emily, a young waitress with a warm smile and a kind heart, the chaos had become second nature. At 24, she worked double shifts at Mary's Diner, dreaming of finishing her nursing degree while navigating a sea of financial struggles. Each customer brought a different story, but today, an elderly widow named Mrs. Thompson would leave an indelible mark on her life. The bell above the door jingled as Mrs. Thompson walked in, clutching a small, worn purse. Her frail figure was clad in a modest gray coat, and she moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone for whom every step held meaning. Emily noticed her immediately. Something about the woman's presence felt poignant, a quiet dignity that carried an undercurrent of sorrow. Emily greeted her with her signature smile. "Welcome to Mary's. Let me get you seated." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her voice soft but tinged with gratitude. "Thank you, dear. Just a quiet spot, if you have one." Emily guided her to a corner booth, away from the noisier tables filled with chatting families and hurried businessmen. Mrs. Thompson settled in, carefully smoothing the edges of the tablecloth with trembling hands. Emily handed her a menu and offered, "Take your time. I'll be back to take your order when you're ready." Minutes later, Emily returned to find Mrs. Thompson still poring over the menu, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Can I help you decide?" Emily asked gently. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, then pointed to the soup section. "I'll have the tomato soup, please." "Just that. And a glass of water." Emily sensed the apprehension in her voice, the way her eyes darted to the prices on the menu. The tomato soup was the cheapest item available, and Emily's heart tightened. Still, she nodded cheerfully. "Coming right up." As the day wore on, Emily observed Mrs. Thompson from the corner of her eye. The older woman sipped her soup slowly, savoring each bite, but Emily noticed her pushing the bowl away before finishing it, as though rationing herself. When the check was discreetly placed on her table, Mrs. Thompson froze. She pulled out her wallet and began counting coins with a nervous urgency. Emily approached the table with her most reassuring smile. "How's the soup?" "It's lovely, dear." "Just lovely," Mrs. Thompson replied, but there was a slight tremble in her voice. She clutched her purse tightly, her hands shaking as she continued to count. Emily glanced at the check, then back at the frail woman. Without a second thought, she placed her hand lightly on Mrs. Thompson's. "Excuse me for just a moment." She walked to the register, pulling a few bills from her apron pocket. It wasn't much, just the tips she'd earned from her earlier shift, but it was enough. She handed the cash to the cashier and returned to Mrs. Thompson's table. "All taken care of, ma'am," Emily said with a warm smile. Mrs. Thompson looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "But why? You didn't have to do that." I could have managed." Emily shook her head. "Please don't worry about it. It's my treat. Consider it a small thank you for coming in today." The elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her voice thick with emotion. "You're such a kind soul, dear. My late husband, Harold, always said the world needs more people like you." Emily pulled up a chair and sat beside her, sensing the need for conversation. "Tell me about Harold. What was he like?" Mrs. Thompson's face softened, and a faint smile appeared. "Oh, Harold was everything. We were married for 50 years. He was a writer, always scribbling away in his notebooks. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. When he passed 3 years ago, I thought my world had ended." Her voice faltered, and Emily reached out, covering Mrs. Thompson's hand with her own. "He sounds wonderful. 50 years is an incredible journey." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her gaze distant. "It was. And now, I try to hold on to those memories. Coming to little places like this helps." Harold loved diners. He used to say they were the heartbeat of a town. Emily smiled, deeply moved by the woman's words. They talked for a while longer, sharing stories of love, loss, and resilience. For Emily, it was a rare pause in her busy day, a moment that reminded her why small acts of kindness mattered. When Mrs. Thompson finally rose to leave, she hugged Emily tightly. "Thank you, my dear. You've been a blessing today. I'll never forget your kindness." Emily watched her walk out the door, the bell jingling softly as it closed behind her. She had no idea that the simple act of paying for a meal would ripple into something far greater. The unexpected visitor. It was a crisp Tuesday morning at Mary's diner, and Emily was midway through a particularly hectic breakfast rush. The sound of clinking plates and the hum of chatter filled the room as she juggled coffee refills and pancake orders. Despite the busyness, her mind drifted now and then to Mrs. Thompson, the sweet elderly widow who had left such an impression on her a few days ago. Emily hadn't seen her again since that day, but the warmth of their interaction lingered like a comforting memory. The bell above the diner's door jingled, snapping Emily back to the present. She turned to greet the new customer but paused when she noticed the man standing in the doorway. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His sharp, professional demeanor seemed out of place in the humble diner. The man scanned the room and walked directly to Emily. "Are you Emily Harper?" he asked, his voice formal but polite. Emily nodded, taken aback. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Thomas Langley, an attorney representing the estate of the late Mrs. Margaret Thompson," he said, offering a crisp handshake. Emily's heart sank at the mention of Mrs. Thompson's name. "Late?" she repeated, her voice soft with disbelief. "Yes, I'm afraid so," Mr. Langley confirmed. "Mrs. Thompson passed away peacefully 2 days ago. I understand you were one of the last people to interact with her, and she spoke very highly of you." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm so sorry to hear that. She was such a kind lady." Mr. Langley gave a small nod, his expression somber but professional. "She thought the same of you. In fact, she left instructions regarding a matter that concerns you. May we speak privately?" Emily gestured toward an empty booth in the corner, her curiosity mingled with a growing unease. She sat across from Mr. Langley, wiping her hands nervously on her apron as he opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Mrs. Thompson was not only kind but also extraordinarily generous," he began. "She was, as you may not have known, a woman of considerable means. Despite her modest appearance, she was a philanthropist who dedicated much of her life to helping others." Emily's eyebrows shot up in surprise. I had no idea." Mr. Langley continued. "Mrs. Thompson owned multiple properties, held significant investments, and supported numerous charitable organizations. While her primary estate and assets were allocated to those causes, she left specific instructions to ensure her gratitude to you was expressed." He opened the folder, revealing several official-looking documents, and slid a letter across the table. Emily stared at it, her name written in delicate, looping handwriting she recognized as Mrs. Thompson's. With trembling hands, she unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dear Emily, when you paid for my meal that day, you didn't just buy me dinner, you restored a piece of my faith in humanity. In that moment, I saw a glimmer of the kindness that Harold always believed existed in the world. Your selflessness moved me deeply, and I want you to know how much it meant to me. I've spent my life trying to make the world a better place, and it's clear to me that you are someone who will do the same if given the opportunity. To that end, I have left you something that I hope will help you chase your dreams and continue spreading kindness to others. With gratitude and love. Margaret Thompson." Emily wiped away a tear as she finished reading, overwhelmed by the sentiment behind the words. "I don't understand," she said softly, looking at Mr. Langley. He cleared his throat. "In accordance with Mrs. Thompson's wishes, I am here to inform you that she has left you $250,000, to be transferred to your account immediately upon the completion of some minor paperwork." The words hung in the air, and Emily blinked, certain she had misheard. $250,000, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mr. Langley confirmed with a nod. Additionally, she has left you a handwritten note suggesting you use the money to finish your education and support causes close to your heart. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, her emotions a mixture of shock, gratitude, and disbelief. I don't even know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Mr. Langley replied, his expression softening. Mrs. Thompson saw something special in you. This is her way of ensuring that your kindness and potential are nurtured. For a moment, Emily sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. Her financial struggles, the looming cost of nursing school, and the countless double shifts, it all suddenly felt lighter, as though the weight she had carried for so long was finally lifting. Is this real? She finally asked, her voice cracking. Mr. Langley smiled faintly. It is very real, Ms. Harper. Mrs. Thompson's estate has already authorized the transfer. All that's left is for you to sign these documents, and the funds will be released to you. Emily stared at the documents on the table, the reality sinking in. She thought about Mrs. Thompson's quiet presence that day, her stories of Harold, and the gratitude in her tearful goodbye. That small act of kindness, paying for a meal without expecting anything in return, had led to something she could never have imagined. As she picked up the pen to sign, her hand still trembling, Emily whispered a silent thank you to Mrs. Thompson, vowing to honor her legacy. She didn't yet know how, but she was determined to use this incredible gift to make a difference, just as Mrs. Thompson had done her entire life. When Mr. Langley stood to leave, he extended his hand once more. Congratulations, Emily. I believe Mrs. Thompson chose well. Emily shook his hand, her heart full of gratitude. The life-changing gift. The following morning, Emily sat on her small, worn-out couch, staring at the email confirmation from her bank. The account balance seemed surreal, 6 digits of security and possibility that her life had never known. For years, she had lived paycheck to paycheck, juggling double shifts and college classes, her dreams of becoming a nurse always overshadowed by financial stress. Now, everything had changed. But with the change came a heavy weight. What would she do with this incredible gift? How could she possibly use it in a way that honored Mrs. Thompson's faith in her? Emily leaned back, clutching the envelope Mr. Langley had left with her. In it was Mrs. Thompson's diary, a worn leather book tied with a faded ribbon. Inside the front cover was a handwritten note. Emily. I've carried this diary for many years, filling its pages with my hopes, thoughts, and dreams. If you are reading this, then you have been entrusted with something dear to my heart. Use this as a guide if you ever feel lost. Above all, remember, kindness changes lives. With a deep breath, Emily untied the ribbon and opened the first page. The handwriting was small and delicate, yet steady, and the first entry was dated nearly 3 decades earlier. Over the next few days, Emily pored over the diary whenever she had a spare moment. Mrs. Thompson's words were a treasure trove of wisdom and compassion. She wrote about her love for Harold, their humble beginnings, and how they'd spent their lives giving back, despite not having much themselves. One entry stood out to Emily. January 12, 1998. Harold always said the greatest wealth isn't what we accumulate but what we share. Today, we gave our last $20 to a family stranded on the highway. We didn't have much ourselves, but the joy on their faces was worth more than any bank account balance. Harold was right, kindness is its own kind of treasure. Another entry brought tears to Emily's eyes. July 22, 2007. I saw a young girl today, barely 15, begging for food outside the grocery store. I gave her what I could and told her to never give up hope. I don't know what her future holds, but I believe one small act of kindness can ripple through her life and beyond. By the time Emily closed the diary, she felt an undeniable sense of purpose. Mrs. Thompson hadn't just left her money, she'd left a mission. The widow's life had been a testament to the power of generosity, and Emily knew she couldn't squander the opportunity she'd been given. Despite the life-changing sum in her bank account, Emily decided to continue working at the diner. She didn't want the money to change her values or how she interacted with the world. It was a tool, not a definition of who she was. Besides, the diner was where she'd met Mrs. Thompson, and it felt like the right place to begin honoring her legacy. Emily began by discreetly helping those around her. She started with her coworker, Maria, a single mother struggling to pay for daycare. Without revealing her identity as the benefactor, Emily paid 3 months of daycare fees and left an anonymous note in Maria's locker. "For all the times you've stayed strong for your little one. Keep being amazing." Maria's reaction was heartwarming, tears of relief and gratitude as she hugged everyone at the diner, never knowing Emily was behind it. Next, Emily turned her attention to the elderly couple who lived in her apartment building. They often talked about their broken heating system but couldn't afford to fix it. With the help of a trusted repair service, Emily arranged for the heater to be replaced. Again, she left an anonymous note. Because everyone deserves warmth, especially those who have shared so much of it with others. The changes didn't stop there. Emily started paying off small debts for struggling families she learned about through casual conversations at the diner. She left gift cards for groceries, donated to local charities, and even funded scholarships for young students at the community college she once attended. One day, as Emily was sweeping the floor during a quiet afternoon shift, she overheard a conversation at a nearby table. A man in his 30s was speaking quietly to his friend, clearly distressed. "I don't know what to do," he said, running a hand through his hair. "My wife's surgery is next week, and we still don't have enough to cover the bills. I've tried everything." Emily's heart ached as she listened. That evening, she stayed late after her shift and carefully drafted an anonymous letter. In it, she included a check covering the remaining cost of the surgery, along with a simple message. "Your love and determination inspire others. Please accept this gift as a reminder that you are not alone." The next week, the man returned to the diner, this time with his wife by his side. He asked for the manager and, with tears in his eyes, expressed his gratitude for the mysterious benefactor. "I don't know who did this," he said, his voice cracking. "But whoever you are, you've saved my wife's life. Thank you." Emily listened from behind the counter, her eyes welling up with tears. She didn't need recognition, the joy and relief on the couple's faces were enough. As the months passed, Emily's quiet acts of generosity began to ripple through the community. People talked about the guardian angel who seemed to be everywhere at once, helping those in need without asking for anything in return. One evening, as Emily closed the diner, she sat alone in a booth and pulled out Mrs. Thompson's diary. Flipping to a blank page, she picked up a pen and began to write. February 10, 2025. Dear Mrs. Thompson, I hope I'm making you proud. Your gift has changed my life in ways I never imagined, and I'm doing my best to pass that gift on to others. Every time I help someone, I think of you and Harold. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for showing me that kindness is the greatest wealth of all. Closing the diary, Emily smiled. She wasn't just honoring Mrs. Thompson's legacy, she was living it. And in doing so, she was creating her own legacy of compassion, one act of kindness at a time. A new mission. Emily sat at the small kitchen table in her modest apartment, surrounded by papers, a laptop, and Mrs. Thompson's diary. Over the past few months, her quiet acts of generosity had grown into something she could no longer handle alone. The requests for help, some direct, others relayed through the diner, kept coming, and though she wanted to help everyone, she knew her resources were finite. That's when the idea struck her: she needed to create a structured way to channel her efforts, something sustainable and capable of reaching more people. She decided to start a community fund in honor of Mrs. Thompson, naming it the Harold and Margaret Thompson Kindness Fund. The birth of the Kindness Fund. With a portion of the money Mrs. Thompson had left her, Emily hired an accountant and a lawyer to help establish the fund. Her mission was clear: assist people in the community struggling with housing, education, and medical expenses. The fund would operate anonymously to protect recipients' dignity and focus solely on spreading kindness and opportunity. Emily announced the fund with a simple flyer posted in the diner and shared on local community boards. The Harold and Margaret Thompson Kindness Fund. Because kindness changes lives. If you or someone you know is in need of financial assistance for housing, education, or medical expenses, please contact us. No strings, no judgment, just help. The response was overwhelming. Within days, Emily received dozens of emails and handwritten letters from people in her community. Some shared heart-wrenching stories of eviction notices, mounting medical bills, or the inability to afford tuition. Others wrote on behalf of neighbors or friends, highlighting their struggles and resilience. The impact grows. One of the first recipients of the fund was Mrs. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s. Her landlord had raised her rent, and she was on the verge of losing her home. Through the fund, Emily quietly paid 6 months of Mrs. Jenkins's rent, giving her the stability to find more affordable housing. Another was Javier, a hard-working high school senior who dreamed of becoming an engineer. His family couldn't afford the application fees for colleges, let alone tuition. The fund not only covered his application fees but also provided a scholarship for his first year. As these stories spread, word of the Kindness Fund began to inspire others. Local businesses started contributing, offering discounts and donations to support the cause. The diner's owner, Mary, pledged a portion of the monthly profits to the fund, saying, "This community has given me so much over the years. It's time I give something back." Soon, volunteers stepped forward to help Emily manage the growing operation. Some assisted with reviewing applications, while others organized fundraising events. A local high school hosted a charity bake sale, and a church group held a car wash, donating all proceeds to the fund. Ripples of transformation. As the fund grew, so did its impact. Families on the brink of homelessness found stability. Students who had given up on college received scholarships. Individuals drowning in medical debt were able to breathe again. One of the most touching cases was that of the Martinez family. After their father was injured at work, the family struggled to cover basic expenses. The fund stepped in, paying their rent and utility bills for 3 months. In gratitude, the Martinez children drew a picture of a heart surrounded by hands, with the words, "Gracias por su bondad, thank you for your kindness." Emily hung it on her refrigerator as a daily reminder of why she started this journey. As the community began to thrive, Emily noticed a shift. Acts of kindness became contagious. People began paying it forward, inspired by the work of the Kindness Fund. A local grocer started offering free produce to families in need. A mechanic volunteered to fix cars at no cost for those who couldn't afford repairs. Emily often returned home after long days at the diner and fund meetings feeling overwhelmed, but in the best way possible. She knew she couldn't solve every problem, but every story of transformation reinforced her belief that small acts of kindness could create profound change. Recognition and reflection. A few months later, the local newspaper ran a feature on the Harold and Margaret Thompson Kindness Fund. While the article respected Emily's request for anonymity, it praised the initiative for revitalizing the community. The headline read, "Kindness Fund turns struggles into second chances." One evening, as Emily sat in the diner after closing, flipping through Mrs. Thompson's diary, a young woman approached her. "Are you Emily Harper?" the woman asked hesitantly. Emily nodded, surprised. "Yes, I am. How can I help you?" "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "My brother was able to have his surgery because of the Kindness Fund. He's recovering now, and we wouldn't have made it without you. Thank you for believing in people like us." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she embraced the woman. "You don't have to thank me. Just take care of your brother, and maybe help someone else when you can." A legacy of kindness. By the end of the year, the Kindness Fund had assisted dozens of families, students, and individuals. But Emily knew the work was far from over. Inspired by Mrs. Thompson's diary, she set her sights on expanding the fund's reach, partnering with other community organizations to tackle systemic issues like affordable housing and access to healthcare. Emily's life had transformed in ways she never expected, but she remained grounded, serving coffee and pancakes at the diner every morning. For her, the true reward wasn't the recognition or even the fund's success, it was the quiet joy of knowing she had carried forward Mrs. Thompson's legacy of kindness and compassion. And just like Mrs. Thompson's small act of gratitude had changed Emily's life, Emily's work was now changing the lives of countless others, one kind gesture at a time. Full circle. It was a quiet Wednesday morning at Mary's diner, and Emily was refilling the salt shakers at the counter. Business had slowed since the breakfast rush, giving her a rare moment to breathe. Though her life had grown busier than ever with her work at the Harold and Margaret Thompson Kindness Fund, she still made time for her shifts at the diner. It grounded her, reminding her of where this journey had begun. As the bell above the door jingled, Emily glanced up to greet the new customer. A woman in her early 30s walked in, holding the hand of a small boy no older than 5. Her clothes were simple, and there was a tiredness in her eyes, but her smile was warm as she looked around the room. Emily approached her with a friendly smile. "Welcome to Mary's. Table for 2?" The woman nodded, her gaze lingering on Emily for a moment. "Yes, please." Emily led them to a booth by the window and handed over the menus. "Take your time. I'll be back in a few minutes to take your order." The woman gave a soft smile, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. As Emily walked back to the counter, she felt the woman's gaze following her. A few minutes later, Emily returned to the table, pen and notepad in hand. "Have you decided what you'd like?" The woman hesitated, then said, "Actually, before I order, can I ask you something? Are you Emily Harper?" Emily blinked, surprised. "Yes, I am. Do we know each other?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to take Emily's hand. "You may not remember me, but I'll never forget you. My name is Laura. About 6 months ago, I received an anonymous check from the Harold and Margaret Thompson Kindness Fund. It covered my rent when I was on the verge of eviction. That money saved my family." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. Though she couldn't remember Laura specifically, there had been so many people helped by the fund, her words struck a chord. Laura continued, her voice trembling. "My husband passed away unexpectedly last year, and I was left with 2 kids, no job, and no idea how to keep going. I was behind on rent, and the landlord had given me 2 weeks to vacate. I was packing up our things, preparing for the worst, when I opened that envelope. It felt like a miracle. For the first time in months, I could breathe." Emily's eyes welled with tears. "I'm so glad it helped. That's exactly why the fund exists." Laura smiled through her tears. "It didn't just help. It changed everything. Because of that gift, I was able to stay in our home, find a stable job, and start rebuilding. My son," she gestured to the little boy, who was busy coloring on the children's menu, "now has a safe place to grow up. And my daughter, who's in high school, can focus on her studies instead of worrying about where we're going to live. You saved us, Emily. I don't know how to thank you." Emily shook her head, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. "You don't have to thank me. The fund exists because of someone else's kindness. I'm just passing it on." Laura tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Someone else's kindness? What do you mean?" Taking a deep breath, Emily shared the story of Mrs. Thompson, the elderly widow who had inspired it all. She described their chance meeting at the diner, the heartfelt conversation, and the incredible gift Mrs. Thompson had left her. "Mrs. Thompson believed that kindness could change lives," Emily concluded. "She didn't just give me money, she gave me a purpose. And now, seeing how that purpose has helped you and your family, it's proof that she was right." Laura's smile grew, and she squeezed Emily's hand. "You've honored her legacy in the most beautiful way. Because of you, my family has hope again. And I promise to pay it forward, just like you've done." The ripple effect. After Laura and her son finished their meal, Emily watched them leave the diner, her heart full of gratitude and reflection. She thought about how far she had come, from struggling waitress to community benefactor, and how it all began with a simple act of kindness. Later that evening, Emily sat in her apartment, Mrs. Thompson's diary open on the table before her. She flipped to one of her favorite entries and read the words aloud. One small act of kindness can ripple through someone's life and beyond. It may seem insignificant in the moment, but its effects are immeasurable. Emily smiled, feeling the truth of those words in every fiber of her being. Mrs. Thompson's gift had rippled through Emily's life, transforming her struggles into opportunities. And now, that ripple was reaching others, growing larger with each act of kindness. As she closed the diary, Emily picked up her own notebook and began writing. Today, I met a woman named Laura. She reminded me of why I do this, why Mrs. Thompson's kindness matters so much. The ripple effect is real, and it's growing every day. I may never see the full extent of it, but I know it's there. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for believing in me and showing me the power of compassion. I will never stop passing it on. From that day forward, Emily continued her mission with renewed purpose. The Kindness Fund grew, touching lives far beyond her small community. But no matter how far it reached, Emily remained the same, a humble waitress with a heart full of gratitude, determined to honor Mrs. Thompson's enduring legacy. And just as Mrs. Thompson's kindness had changed Emily's life, Emily's work was now inspiring countless others to believe in the transformative power of compassion, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness could create a legacy that lived on forever.